Hey everybody, Ronroy here, and today I want to showcase my Fury Bash Barbarian build that could be considered one of the best in the new Diablo 4 meta. The build can handle 110p just fine, without bugged Elixir, which is a great result by itself, and potentially can push even further. It can also destroy all Tormented bosses, and Uber Lilith without any kind of issue, while staying tanky and pretty easy to play. Let's go forward and I will explain how the build works and what makes it strong. So the main idea of the build is pretty much to utilize the new cool tempering that we can add to all of our weapons. Bash Glyphs for additional percentage of damage. It can be so high, especially at two-handed weapons, reaching 500% of additional damage, which makes Bash just an amazing skill for the current meta. On top of that, since Bash is a basic skill and it costs no fury, even generates fury, we can use Rameladny Magnum Opus. With Rameladny, we are going to receive multiplicative damage bonus per each point of fury that we have. And since we don't have any skills that pretty much cause the fury, we are going to stay at the maximum at almost all times. It also gives an opportunity to utilize Edgemaster aspect, since we have maximum fury at all times and we are generating it constantly with the Bash attacks. All of that together makes Bash Barbarian a huge damage dealer, especially when we have maximum fury, and well, we will have it pretty often. On top of that, we can use a lot of new mechanics to pretty much ensure that our characters surviving pretty good. We can use Warcry to get our damage up, we can use Challenging Shot together with Iron Skin to reach a pretty much amazing survivability, especially the Iron Skin, which can provide a huge barrier every time when we are receiving a little damage and we can just click it. On top of that, with Tactical Iron Skin we will be able to just heal tremendously for almost full health every time when we are using Iron Skill itself. It makes the Barbarian a very tanky character, especially since we can stack health on almost all the items in the build. All of that together is pretty much open a lot of place on our items to reach critical strike chance on our rings, on our amulets and on the gloves as well. That way we can pretty much reach close to 100% of critical strike chance, and our bash is going to just crit enemies consistently. On top of that, we can use Steel Grasp to pretty much group enemies together, to cleave them pretty fast with our bash and just move forward to the next pack. For bosses, we also have Call of the Ancients, which are going to provide some additional attack speed and damage bonuses. That way, the build is very simple to play, and we can utilize a lot of simple skills such as shouts just by clicking them all the time when they are not on the cooldown, and use some skills that good in the moment, such as Steel Grasp, for example. Another pretty important part is pretty much moving your arsenal selection to a proper pick. By default, Bash is picking Hammer. However, we will need to use Rameladny, so you will need to move it from auto select to dual wield. Make sure that you have dual wield at your main skill at all times, because that way you're going to use Rameladny and you're going to get damage bonus for your fury. The pretty important question, how to keep Berserkering, because we don't have a lot of Berserkering sources. To do that, I recommend to spam Steel Grasp constantly, because Steel Grasp can have a passive Fighter Steel Grasp. It's going to give us 2 seconds of Berserkering every time when Steel Grasp is damaging an enemy. And since we don't have a lot of cooldown for Steel Grasp, it should be around 7 seconds, and we have a lot of ways to lower our cooldowns. We should have Steel Grasp very consistently, and I recommend to spam it even at bosses, for example, just to keep Berserkering up. So talking about unique items for the build, the most important one is the Rameladny Magnum Opus. You can get it from Lord Zir or from Grigor, and if you aim for better item power and possibly like a start one, I recommend to do the Tormented version of both bosses. And you can also use the helmet. Task Helm of the Druids is pretty much a nice option. However, most of the time I recommend to use Harlequin Crest Shaco instead. In the Season 4 it's so easy to get the Shaco, and you can just click the video that I will leave in the first comment to pretty much see how you can do that. So if you have the Shaco, which is pretty easy to get, I recommend to use that instead. Any other uniques or uber uniques are pretty much not required. However, you can try to add something into the build to make it stronger if you feel like it. There's also an option to use Pain Gorger gauntlets for better clear. However, I don't really feel like those are necessary. Most of the time when you're grouping enemies, you're going to kill them pretty fast with Bash anyway. Yet, if you're aiming for a speed farming part, Pain Gorgers could come in handy, so feel free to use them too if you like it. So talking about the aspects, the most important aspect for the build is pretty much aspect of adaptability. You will need to buff it on your amulet, and that way you will be able to get additional damage for your basic attacks when you have more than 50% of maximum resource. That's an amazing damage, so try to roll it as high as possible. As you can see, mine is not maxed, and perfectly it should be maxed in almost all cases. So second aspect in terms of importance is pretty much aspect of the Edge Master, because that way you're going to receive much more damage. You're going to stay at the maximum primary resource at almost all times. That way aspect of the Edge Masters providing a huge damage bonus. We're using Ramaladni and Rapid Wolf's Bite. So here you can get additional attack speed for your basic skill, which is pretty important. Even if you're using dual wielding, additional attack speed is always nice. So Spinal of the Moonrise here can give you an aspect of the Moonrise by itself. That way we can get additional damage for basic skills when we're stacking vampiric stacks. We're also getting some attack speed, which is pretty nice as well. On the rings, I recommend to go for aspect of the elements, because it has physical as the first bonus, and when it will cycle to a proper part, you're going to do much more damage. And on the second ring, I recommend to go with aspect of the inner calm. Inner calm is definitely not perfect, because we still need to run around pretty often. However, it can provide at least 10% of additional damage, and it's a pretty good option by itself. On the gloves, I recommend to go with aspect of the Conceited. That way you can get additional damage every time while you have a barrier. Pretty much when we are using Iron Skin, we are getting huge barrier and it's staying on us pretty consistently. That way even when we are using Iron Skin and we are getting the barrier, we will do more damage, and I think it's pretty much worth it. When we are talking about the defensive aspects, so I recommend to go with aspect of the Sovereign here for Iron Skin that grants Unstoppable and damage reduction. Unstoppable is the most important part here, because we will need to get Unstoppable from somewhere, and that way getting it from Iron Skin is probably the easiest option. On the pants, I recommend to go for aspect of the Might, because that way we'll have like higher damage reduction. And the last part is pretty much your cooldowns. On the boots, I recommend to use aspect of the Hectic. That way every 5 basic attacks will pretty much move our cooldown down, and it will just reduce that number. It's good to keep our shouts up and for ultimate as well. As a helmet, I recommend to use Shaco, as I already mentioned. However, if you are going to use a basic helmet, you can go for any kind of defensive aspect that you like. So if you have no Shaco, the best option would be to use Tusk Helm of the Druids for damage, or pretty much a rare helmet with life and aspect of the Undying to pretty much heal your character more consistently. Both of them will work just fine in case if you don't have Harlequin. So the most important start for the build is pretty much bash Glyphs for additional damage. You need to stack it on all your weapons where you can. On top of that, you will need to stack damage to claws because it's a pretty strong option, critical strike damage because we have critical strike close to 100. And also at least one item, please don't forget to get damage while berserkering, because damage while berserkering is pretty much very important for the build to get our Blood Rage legendary node up. On top of that, when we are talking about rings, for example, you will need to stack critical strike chance and attack speed together with STR on almost all of them. On your amulet, I also recommend to go with STR, attack speed and critical strike chance itself, and the same goes for your gauntlets. On top of that, you will also need to get pants with bash. Perfectly, you should have bash with a star, but even if you don't have a star, I mean, you can get at least +3 to bash at the pants, or +2 as the basic version. When you're rolling defensive items, the most important start should be Imposing Presence, because Imposing Presence is going to provide so much health. And the second stat on the defensive item is pretty much Concussion, because Concussion will make your stun pretty consistent way to crowd control bosses. On your boots I recommend to get movement speed and Steel Grasp stuns for additional seconds, because that's a pretty much nice buff. So talking about 4 resistances in the build, we're stacking it from getting it on legendary chest. We can get at least 24% of resistances on the item itself, and that's a huge bonus. We're also stacking resistances in the stone, so 8% resistances to all elements on all items here. And on top of that, we can pretty much use our Paragon and just use ambidextrous here to pretty much get resistances from the small nodes. All of that together can pretty much lead to 68% of fire, lightning and shadow resistance as well. Cold and poison will be maxed. It's enough to push the pit just fine, and you can use an incense on top of it to pretty much reach the cap too, for higher order content. So talking about the skills for the build, the most important part is pretty much Bash. We're also taking Enhanced Bash, but we don't really need any of those, so I don't really recommend to waste points. On top of the Bash we can just go lower and get Imposing Presence together with Martial Vigor. Both of them are pretty good for survivability. Getting Iron Skin is pretty important too, and I recommend to go for Tactical Iron Skin, because that way every moment when you're going to use Iron Skin itself, it's going to heal you very good, to your maximum health at the most times. I also recommend to take Outburst and pretty much Tough as Nails, because that way any enemies that pretty much attacking you going to bleed, and it can activate different bonuses for bleed damage. So we can get like, we're doing additional damage to bleeding enemies, and that's a pretty strong bonuses. Challenging Shout and Enhanced Challenging Shout are pretty much basic stuff by itself. We're taking Warcry and some additional passives here for cries. It's very important to take both No Mercy and Slaying Strike, because that way we're going to deal more damage by itself. Steel Grasp is pretty important too, and Fighter Steel Grasp will pretty much lead us to getting Berserkering as often as possible. So try to just spam Steel Grasp in almost all cases to get Berserkering from Fighter Steel Grasp. We're taking Call of the Ancients, but not for the Ancients themselves. We just need Prime Call of the Ancients. It will provide us 20% of bonus attack speed and 20% of increased damage, and it's pretty much worth it. I also recommend to take Well Up and at least some ranks into Concussion, together with a Duelist for additional attack speed, and the rest of the points can go to Tempered Fury. I have only one here right now, but you can add one from Concussion too, if you have enough crit stun chance at the time. The last passive is pretty much Unconstrained, because Unconstrained is still providing as much damage as possible, and it's recommended at almost all Barbarian builds. We can't utilize any of those, so Unconstrained is the only option available for the build. So talking about the Paragon of the build, it's pretty simple. In the first part we are taking Ire, just for damage while Berserkering bonus. Progressing to the top, the next board is pretty much Blood Rage. It's pretty important because Blood Rage can provide decent amount of damage and just move our damage while Berserkering to overall bonus damage. The glyph here is Revenge, and after that we are moving to the top, and the board is Carnage. Carnage by itself is a pretty nice attack speed boost, and I definitely recommend to take that. We are also taking Territorial, together with Enraged and Berserker. After that we are entering to the right, and the next board is Warbringer. The glyph here is Ambidextrous, just to stack the resistances. It's a pretty important part, so make sure your Ambidextrous as high level as possible, because we will need it to max resistances. Moving forward, the next board is pretty much Weapon Master, and the glyph here is Martial. Martial will help us with cooldown for our shout skills. We don't need anything except ACR here. The next board is pretty much Bonebreaker, and we are taking Exploit here, mostly for additional bonus, and everything else is not important, we are not taking any big notes. And the last board is at the top. it's pretty much Decimator, and Decimator itself provides a decent amount of vulnerable damage. And Glyph here is pretty much undaunted, just to get additional damage reduction while we have a Fortify. So that's been my Fury Bash Barbarian. I hope you pretty much enjoy the build. I think it's an awesome one, and right now it's one of the best builds possible in Diablo 4. Let's see how far I will be able to push the pit visit, and see you next time.